extremely pleased to be here with my friend and colleague, Jose Irwin. Jose, I'm really happy that we won this award to draw attention to such a topic which is very important in the regions where we work. We see this on the ground, people under attack. We need to draw attention to this. We need to act. So I thought it would be really nice to have a moment to talk to you, one of the co-authors of this article, about it. Indeed, and I think one of the highlights for me of this process was not just the end product, the article itself, which, by the way, is not the end product, but it's part of a longer process, but also the fact that we aim for it to be a collective process, a collective thinking process, a collective dialogue process. We had UN special rapporteurs involved, we had NGO voices, we had scientific voices, and really that brought their knowledge and perspectives together sort of in one piece, oriented towards potentially also reinforcing global policy responses to this. The forms of violence encountered by environmental human rights defenders cover such a span, and I felt also that we were trying to draw attention to that. And where we see a lot of media attention focusing mainly on the killings, we need much more systematic attention to the kinds of human rights violations that take place at an everyday level. And the same, in a sense, goes, and I find it interesting with the Escazú agreement, because it also draws attention to that broader kind of responses that's needed. Now, how do you see it now moving from, in a sense, adopting such agreement towards its implementation? In retrospect, from your perspective, what are the key elements that you see where we need to sort of take action to bring these global aspirations and regional aspirations into meaningful action and effects on the ground for the defenders?
It's a huge question, and definitely I don't have the answer, but this is a challenge not only of the Escazú agreement, but of the Human Rights Council resolution on environmental rights defenders. Yeah. The recently passed IUCN resolution on environmental rights defenders, and so many other resolutions and statements that have been made by the Inter-American Human Rights System and others. Definitely states need to take action, and this action has different dimensions. This it also has some legal dimensions in terms of redrafting legislation and generating mechanisms, judicial mechanism, non-judicial mechanism, remedies that enable people that are suffering these threats and these attacks, environmental rights defenders, indigenous, non-indigenous, to have access to custody and reparation in case they've been damaged by these environmental rights defenders. There's also the need to build policies that enable people to have access to these mechanisms. There's also the need of international mechanisms such as the UN and the Inter-American Human Rights System to have precautionary measures to be effective. There's so many cases in which precautionary measures have been approved, but in practice they're not being implemented. And in the case of Berta Cáceres, she had a precautionary measure. In the case of Honduras, but she was killed even having a precautionary measure. So there's too many dimensions to be tackled with.
We have protection mechanisms for environmental human rights defenders, but very often they're not effective, or they're not reaching those most at risk, or even in some cases we've seen a call now for different types of action. Indeed, defenders themselves are increasingly getting organized also and coming up with other proposals that insist upon not these being individual issues, but about collective protection, that it involves addressing some of the structural causes behind also people coming at risk in the first place. So I think really there's a strong push in this direction. What you were asking me about how our conversations went at the IUCN Congress in September. So one of our hopes, of course, with the article was to help shape a little bit the thinking of this union of conservation organizations, more than 1,000 organizations that come together every 4 years to think about this. And as you said, we were happy to see that our recommendations to have a resolution on this were followed through, it was adopted. So hopefully the union now, a global union, is coming together. But as some of the environmental lawyers present at the meeting were saying also, in so many cases, people who undertake these forms of violence, the perpetrators get off the hook. Impunity, unfortunately, is more often the name of the game than rule of law, which is also a significant challenge. But the positive thing now is that we're seeing increasingly the conservation movement step up. Having a resolution now is a call to say it's not enough to be sitting at the negotiation table in Glasgow or be negotiating in China or Geneva, as will be coming up now in January for the Convention on Biological Diversity. It's also important to think about the defenders at the front line and act in solidarity with those and act to support ways of increasing protection. So I'm very hopeful that now we're seeing a bit of a change in the conservation community, to some extent not only being about articulating aspirations, let's protect biodiversity, let's save the climate, but also let's try to protect those who are at the front line, who are actually challenging the kinds of development interventions that are creating environmental havoc, that are making it difficult for us to live up to our climate targets. We need to start protecting those defenders. And in that sense, now what I'm keen to see now on with conservation organizations, not just the UN organizations, but also the big international conservation organizations, is really them stepping up the effort towards being willing to support those who speak up. I think we've come to a moment now where we realize that what sort of the honeymoon period of Rio 1992, civil society is on board, biggest environmental development meeting at the time, a honeymoon period of states speaking to civil society and so on is over. We've seen now that for many civil society organizations, human rights defenders, environmental actors and so on, it's becoming increasingly difficult. The space is also shrinking. It's not easy to get access to the negotiation table. And we need to draw attention to that. Or will states be willing to say, okay, we recognize we have a challenge here and we need to take this on board as an integral part of our biodiversity challenge. We cannot solve the biodiversity challenge without solving the challenge of the people trying to save biodiversity.
That's right, but you know, what I find relevant of this article is that generally, particularly from the Global South, you have a national or a regional picture of problems that are being faced by environmental rights defenders, but you don't have this global approach that the article has, because it tackles different forums and different areas of the world where this phenomenon is taking place and the different avenues to confront and to tackle with this problem. So I definitely feel that we have to take that into consideration.
I agree with you, and I think you're absolutely right in trying to see how we can stimulate that further global conversation. But I do feel that every time I have a conversation with a defender and they're telling me that they have to hide, they're telling me they received death threats, they're telling me they're worried about their family, they're talking about undercover, then I'm saying we're still very far from having a system that really is supportive of human rights on the one hand, but also of equitable conservation on the other.
You know, one of the areas that is dealt with by the article is the responsibility of business enterprises and business entities generally in threats to environmental rights defenders. And this is an issue that has been raised by the Zero Tolerance Initiative, but it's one aspect that has to be moved ahead and has to be promoted, particularly in the context of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights. they are going to elaborate a report on human rights offenders in the context of business activities. So there's so many areas and there's so many forums that we should continue to deal with. So that's why I see, I hope that this article can make a contribution to that.
I agree with you. For me, it also does three things. The first thing is it reminds us that environmental human rights defenders are real people on the ground. As we were negotiating, everyone was watching the news about COP26. Villagers were being attacked in the Brazilian Amazon. Their houses, they were being threatened and so on. There was a real need to help people at risk. The second thing was things can be done. So the fact that defenders now are organizing themselves and saying we can actually find effective ways of protecting ourselves, but we need support for that, was a second reminder for us and the global audience. And the third thing is that, exactly as you say, we need to keep on bringing this topic to the global audience. We need to act upon this. Of course, we need to support people on the ground, but one way of supporting that is also by addressing the structural drivers that are creating these risky situations in the first place. The fact that people are losing their legal protection to their lands, the fact that they're being excluded from decision-making in big development, the fact that a lot of post-colonial legacies and racism continues actually to make certain people more at risk than others. So I think in that sense, the prize hopefully can help draw attention to these kinds of dynamics.